by Montana State Extension out of Whitehall, Madison Conservation District, Madison Valley Ranchlands Group, and the Ruby Valley Conservation District. We had a few different sponsors, including Madison Valley Bank and Opportunity Bank. Is there any other? Northwest Farm Credit. And then Northwest Farm Credit. So those are the sponsors of the event. Tonight's meal was provided by Ruby Valley Meats. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction about Jane. So Jane Mangold is a professor and extension invasive plant specialist at Montana State University in Bozeman. Her outreach and research program focuses on integrated management of invasive and noxious weeds on range, pasture, and natural areas. She has been studying and teaching others about invasive and noxious weeds for about 25 years. So without further ado, we'll invite Jane up to start the conversation.
Good afternoon. It is still afternoon. It's 5:15, so we can still call it afternoon. Moving into evening. So thanks for having me here tonight. You know, we did try to do this. Actually, it was a month ago, February 21st, and postponed. And I think that was a good decision because I looked at the highway map for like 2 days after that. Cause I was kind of like, oh, we didn't do it. I feel kind of like a slouch, and like the road over Virginia City Hill was like hazardous travel conditions for like 2 days. So we have a nicer day today. But, thanks for being here tonight. I'm sure you've all been working hard all day long. And now your belly's gonna be nice and full with this amazing comfort food, lasagna, garlic bread. So we're gonna try to really treat our time together as a roundtable. This is the Rancho Roundtable and not a lecture hall, okay? So what I would like to do is, I have like 65 slides here, and that's everything I know about invasive annual grasses, but I don't necessarily want to tell you everything I know. I would rather get some feedback from you, like what questions do you have about invasive annual grasses? And then I was thinking maybe we could skip around in the presentation and hit those slides that are most directed towards the questions that you have, okay? So invasive annual grasses, we're talking about cheatgrass. It's probably the one that's most familiar to you. Japanese brome or field brome might be and ring a bell with you. Then the most recent high priority species is bentonata. And then Medusa head is the other one that's on the list. But what questions do you have about invasive annual grasses? And I'm gonna jot them down up here, and then we'll try to hit them as we're like the next hour we spend together, okay? Yes, Linda. Oh, did you actually write one down? Oh, yeah, nobody did that. Oh, yes.
Lick it and make it stick.
No, yes, they're not sticky notes. But yes, lay it on me, Linda.
Our invasive annual grass is a problem everywhere on range land in the west.
I'm gonna abbreviate invasive annual grasses, IAG. Okay. In the US or Western US?
Western US.
Okay.
That's my world.
Yep. Our invasive annual grass is a problem on rangeland everywhere in the Western US. Does that capture it? What you were asking? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Do you know where Venata is the closest to like where we're at right now? Do you have any nearby sites?
Okay. My writing is really getting sloppy. Okay, good question. Others? Yes.
The last time I was to a meeting about this topic, they really didn't have much to offer as far as how to control it. So have they got some new things
Mhm.
that you can do?
How about, what can we do about them? Anything new? Is that? Was I giving that presentation?
I think so.
I've been in Madison and especially Madison County several times with talking about, we started out years ago just talking about cheatgrass, kind of more to invasive annual grasses as a whole. Yes, okay, we can talk about that. Yeah,
So my name's Steve Luisi. So I just moved here from Pittsburgh in June of last year and spent my entire career in engineering. So, but now I have 40 acres of sagebrush, and a few junipers, and maybe an occasional pine tree. And so I'm trying to learn as much as I can about how to manage property. So I guess my question is, do these grasses grow in the sage, or where do I find them? Or is it just gonna be along my driveway? Or in an open area, or are they also out in the sagebrush, which is like?
okay, yep, this is good. So how about where should I look for annual grasses? What's kind of their habitat?
Thank you.
Okay. So far, this is great because so far there isn't a question up here I can't give some information about. Other questions?
How are they getting spread?
Ooh, yeah.
If we shut the wind off, are we safe?
A grazing value.
Ooh, good. I got slides for that too.
How's the response to fire?
You guys are gonna be one of the last ones left.
You stole my questions.
Yeah. I should have been home.
My writing's getting smaller and sloppier.
How about,
Smaller for sure.
what are the impacts of invasive annual grasses on soil health?
Okay. We're gonna talk about impacts in general, but we'll say what we can about soil health.
Okay.
Can't say a lot about it, but a little bit. Anything else? We can get rolling on these, and then certainly as we're talking, other questions will probably come up. So again, let's have this be a rancher roundtable, not let's go to the lecture hall and sit through boring lecture after our bellies are nice and full, okay? I'm just gonna move this back here a little bit. And I think we can kind of group these two questions. Are invasive annual grasses a problem on rangeland everywhere in the western US? And then where is Ventonata in particular, like closest to where we are right now? I think let's start there. That's kind of a, distribution question, okay? And I think it's one of the, it's sooner in my slide set than some of the other questions, okay? So let's start with this slide. Let me just give a quick look to see, yeah, okay. How do you feel about identification? And I'm wondering particularly about Ventonata. You think you could identify Ventonata? Okay, we'll spend a little bit of time with that too, all right? Okay, can we turn down any of the lights, Kalina, like, just so the slides show up a little bit? Okay, I think I went too far. Wow, that was weird. Okay. I do want to start with this picture because this is near one of our research sites in southeastern Montana, Bighorn County. This is the road signs at this intersection where we head back to one of our Ventonata sites. Can any of you read the name of the roads that intersect? Yeah, Rotten Grass Creek and Lower Rotten Grass Creek. And that's pretty much what we're talking about with annual grasses and especially Ventonata, which we'll get into some of that when we talk about grazing value and impacts, okay? But these are the 4 grasses that we're kind of focusing on. Cheatgrass, which has been around forever, Japanese brome, which has also been around a long time, and then more recently, Ventonata and Medusa head. So you all have a copy of this. Those 4 grasses are in here. This is mostly focused on identification. And then another grass that's in here that we're not going to talk about today is Phragmites. That's actually a perennial grass that's on the state noxious weed list. But, so these 4 grasses are really, there's this suite of annual grasses that are threatening Montana, but also they've been a problem across the entire West for decades. Okay, so here's a slide that shows the continental distribution of cheatgrass upper left, Japanese brome upper right, and then Medusa head lower left, Ventonata lower right. And any state or province that's shaded in has a record of these species. So you can see cheatgrass and Japanese brome, I mean, they've been documented everywhere in North America, all right? Medusa head and Ventonata, smaller distribution. But really, where these plants are the most problematic is in the western US and really like west of kind of the Dakotas and Nebraska, you know, in Kansas. So probably eastern Montana and getting into western Dakotas is like where you start seeing these species be problematic. And a lot of that has to do with our climate, right? Where these plants kind of make their living by using soil moisture early in the season. We come out of winter here and we typically have really good soil moisture, right? We have good moisture through June, let's say, but then once July hits, we kind of start, the rain kind of shuts off for the most part, and we start getting really dry. And what these annual grasses do is they germinate in the fall. They overwinter as little seedlings, and then they start growing typically earlier in the spring than our perennial grasses do. And by the time it gets hot and dry, these grasses have completed their life cycle and they just dry up and the seeds drop to the ground and they just sit there then until fall, till it starts getting cool and wet again. So they're kind of making their living in this part of North America because that's the type of climate we have. Call it a Mediterranean climate. Cool, wet, falls through early spring and then hot and dry summers, okay? As far as, so cheatgrass and Japanese brome, they've been in Montana since like the late 1800s, all right? They have been increasing more recently. I would say in the last 20 years, probably especially in the last 10 years or so. There was a recent paper that came out where they looked at the presence of annual vegetation, mostly annual grasses, on BLM allotments throughout the western US. And they predict that annual grasses are increasing at about 4% per year. That's been over the last 20 years or so. Okay, so if you think about BLM grazing allotments across the entire western US, that's a fairly, 4% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about vegetation change, it's a pretty substantial change. And I think the number was like, we're losing like 1.4 million acres a year to annual grasses. So your question, Linda, about is it a problem everywhere in the western US? Yes, it is. And it's been a problem in areas to our south and our west for a much longer time than it's been a problem for Montana. We're kind of late to the game in terms of having issues with these plants. And we're just trying to figure it out, right? Thankfully, we do have some new tools that, give us a better chance of kind of stopping the spread of these annual grasses than maybe our friends in Nevada, Utah, and southern Idaho, okay? I want to say a little bit, let's kind of jump to this question here. Where is Ventonata the closest, based on where we are right now? So Ventonata is the newest invader for annual grasses, and it's probably the one that we're most concerned about. It's also called wiregrass or North African wiregrass. This is a picture again from southeastern Montana. That's the Bighorn Mountains in the background. This part of Montana is probably where I've seen the most substantial infestations of Ventonata. But all this grass in the forefront is Ventonata. It's the cover we have research here. The cover of Ventonata at this particular site where I took this photo is like 50% a cover of Ventonata. Here's Ventonata as it dries out a little bit more. This picture is actually from northwestern Montana. So, you think southeastern Montana all the way to northwestern Montana, we're seeing fairly sizable infestations of Ventonata. As it dries out, it gets kind of this yellowish brown appearance. That's what most of this is. It looks a lot like cheatgrass, but not exactly. It's a little more yellow, and it kind of has a sheen to it more so than cheatgrass. A little bit more about Ventonata. It was first documented in North America not until the 1950s. So if you think about cheatgrass and Japanese brome, 1800s, late 1800s, right? This is a much newer invader, and we're still learning a lot about it, trying to understand it. It wasn't documented in Montana till the 1990s. And if you look at the records of where we were seeing it in the 1990s, it was like scattered plants along roadways, right?
How did it get here?
Yeah, good question. I think that's kind of how are they spreading, but Ventonata, we're not sure. I mean, it's hard to go back in time and know exactly how it got here, but it first was showing up along roadways, so probably vehicles, equipment. It has a real light, airy seed that just tends to cling to things by like static electricity. I'll just start passing around a sample here of Ventonata so you have a little better handle of what it looks like. I think that more recently, like I would say probably in the last 10 years, I think we've probably been moving it around in hay. I know I've seen fields where, they're getting, there might be improved grasses seeded there, and they're getting hayed and kind of, the grass is getting cut into hays up like this, and Ventonata's down in the understory. And it's kind of, difficult to see. It has been added to the noxious weed list. It was added in 2019. But prior to that time, people weren't really looking for it. It could have been getting harvested in hay and moved around. And then I think it also, it moves, as I mentioned, it just, the seeds kind of cling. They'll cling to your pant legs, not by the awns, not by those sticky things that you see on cheatgrass, but just from static electricity. But I think it probably moves around on the hooves of animals, the legs and hooves of animals too. Yeah.
Does it spread in irrigated hay crops and grain crops?
We haven't seen it in grain crops, in Idaho. So you'll notice that this bullet says it's problematic in Idaho, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon for like the last 15 years. They have had a problem in Washington. They grow a lot of grass seed in Washington and like Timothy hay. And it's been problematic for Washington, Idaho, and those types of settings.
Especially when it's irrigated then.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to think, I haven't seen it in any irrigated settings here. And actually, I don't even know if like Timothy hay, I don't know for sure if Timothy hay would be, it might be sub-irrigated, but I don't know if it's actually like overhead irrigated or like grass seed, like grass that's grown for seed harvest. I don't know if that's necessarily irrigated. Yeah.
It starts in the wetter areas on the roadside, so it spreads up, right?
Yeah, it likes a little more moisture than like cheatgrass. You'll find it in low lot areas on the landscape and then it tends to move uphill from there. So if you're out just kind of scouting your places, where you're likely to see Ventonata first would be low-lying areas on the land. And, you know, maybe close to a road, or maybe close to a place where you've brought in and stacked some hay or that type of thing. Yeah. Let's see. We're still working on this question. So just to give you a sense of how quickly we've seen Ventonata increase. In these parts of Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, where they first started documenting Ventonata, they've gone back to these sites very recently. This paper was just published the end of last year. And some of these sites where they saw it 10, 15 years earlier, they saw a 30% increase in its cover in that 10 to 15 year period. Okay. I've been working on annual or weedy rangeland species for, 20, 25 years. I've never seen a species spread as quickly as I've seen Ventonata spread. It's pretty amazing. Where is it in Montana? Well, we've been trying to keep track. Josh has been helping me with this. And this is just kind of word of mouth, like when people are reporting finding it. In June of 2018, here's the counties where we had seen Ventonata. And most of the infestations were up in northwestern Montana. Gallatin County had a fair amount, but it was isolated, but when you would find it, it was, pretty abundant locally. So that's June of 2018. Here's 18 months later. You can see it kind of follows the I-90 corridor. Or, that southern tier of the state. And then this was October 2019. We hadn't really heard of any additional sightings until just this winter. I was doing a tour in eastern Montana and the BLM folks out of Miles City have seen it in Fallon County, which is Baker. Right. So, it's around, I'm trying to think. We have seen it at Red Bluff Research Ranch over by Norris. Helena or anyone local here that's familiar with it, any information on Madison? Or we still haven't seen it. It hasn't been documented in Jefferson County yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's there. any information locally? No.
Need Dale here.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to think. Yeah, the closest place I can think of would be, we did find some at Red Bluff. So 30 miles away.
Broadwater also claims they don't have it.
Yeah, but yeah, Broadwater, that, yeah,
And
Might not be in
supposedly
Broadwater.
has a fraction of an acre.
okay. Treasure.
So it's moving around.
So, you know, this is probably, this, what seems like fairly rapid expansion. I would say it's a combination of us talking about it more, right? And more people looking for it on the landscape, that's for sure. But I also, I mean, I've seen some of the infestations that were up in this area expand very rapidly in a short time. So I also think that there's expansion of populations where it's been growing. It's not just a matter of, oh, well, we're looking for it now, so we're seeing it. Okay. And yeah, it was added to the noxious weed list in 2019. So it is one of 3 grasses that we have on the state noxious weed list: Bentonata, Medusa head, and Phragmites. Okay. Any more? Okay. Is that, have we answered these questions well enough? I'm gonna put a check mark. Okay,
Don't buy seed from Idaho. Some of the guys up in like Lincoln and Sanders County go to Bonner's Ferry to buy it instead of Kalispell. It's not listed in Idaho, as you can see, so.
yeah. They kind of gave up on it and decided not to list it.
What's the seed bank, viability?
Yeah, okay. Before we go to that, we've kind of addressed this. How are these, especially we've been talking most about Bentonata, but how is it spreading? Bentonata can spread a little bit by wind. It tends to want to tumble if it does break off. But most of these annual grasses are just spreading from sticking to things. Vehicles, animals, your socks and shoes, right? Think about cheatgrass and the awns on cheatgrass, right? How they stick to things. Hay, they're getting spread around in hay. So I think, I don't actually have slides to talk about this, but the question always comes up, so. All right. Should we tackle this one? Well, then we're gonna come to we'll talk some about the biology and get like the seed viability. Where should I look for invasive annual grasses? Any place you have disturbance, these annual grasses are gonna do well. So along roads, places where you might be, you know, piling hay, or, you know, you're in and out of there a lot. But they will grow across a range of habitats. So they're gonna be in your state, they could be down in the understory of the sagebrush. They could be mixed in with an improved pasture, right, where you've had improved grasses seeded, like smooth brome or timothy. They kind of can be anywhere, but if you were gonna look for them first, I would look for those areas where you have disturbance on the landscape, okay? You gotta have, they like disturbed areas, and then couple that with places where you think seeds are likely to get to. Whether it's animal trails, roads, you know, wherever animals and people go, these seeds are traveling with us and with the animals.
How about higher elevation like stock trails and coniferous forests?
Yeah, so cheatgrass, we've studied cheatgrass more than anything because it's been around the longest and the biggest problem. We used to think that it couldn't go above, like 5,000 or 6,000 feet elevation, but we are seeing it move up in elevation, especially as temperatures warm. And we get a little drier, right? So you would find it at trailheads where stock trailers might be. It would have a harder time getting into the backcountry. Not that it couldn't get there, but it's just not gonna do quite as well. Now, Ventonata, it does okay in forested settings. Some of the forests, like in eastern Oregon, northwestern Washington, or northwestern Montana, we're actually finding Ventonata in forested settings. And, maybe if there's some logging done where you couple that, the seed source with the disturbance we see, then it starts increasing, like along the drag trails or along the roads that are put in. So again, it's a coupling of disturbance with the seed source, moving the seeds around. These annual grasses are gonna take advantage of bare ground if they have the chance. Okay. All right, should we go to biology? I do want to cover identification while we're together. But let's go to biology and impacts. How's that sound? We'll talk some about seed longevity, how the plants grow, what some of the impacts are. Okay, so here we are. So I already mentioned that these are what we call winter annuals. So what do you know about an annual? An annual plant versus a perennial plant? Go back to like biology 101.
Grows from seed every year.
It grows from seed every year, an annual does. And what happens to the plant after it flowers and produces the seed? It dies. Yeah, it's not like spotted knapweed or leafy spurs. It's gonna come back from that root every year. These things, they grow, they flower, produce seed, the plant dies. The seeds are what starts it all over the next generation, okay? When we say winter annuals, that means that the seeds are actually germinating in the fall. They overwinter as seedlings and then complete their life cycle the following summer. That's opposed to a summer annual, which starts from a seed in the spring, all right? Any guesses on your favorite summer annual weed?
Foxtail.
Foxtail's actually perennial, yeah. Like foxtail barley. Yeah, but, yeah. Did you have a summer annual? Well, one that comes to mind is, wild oat. That's actually a summer annual. Kochia is a summer annual. Russian thistle, they actually come up as seedlings in the spring and complete their life cycle. Just a little tidbit there. So here's just another depiction of this life cycle, okay? So here we are right now, we're coming out of winter, early spring, seedling. They're gonna complete their life cycle by early summer. Cheatgrass probably earlier than anything, followed by Japanese brome, and then Ventonata. Medusa head would be even later. And then, they're producing those seeds and dying, okay?
How long does the seed stay viable?
Perfect segue, and you had asked the question too. The seeds don't live very long, and that's kind of the Achilles heel for these annual grasses, if they had one, right? The seeds don't live very long. When plants growing this summer produce their seed, probably 90+% of those seeds are gonna grow that first fall and the following summer, right? A small percentage of them stay dormant and do that the next year. Maybe an even smaller percent 2 years afterwards. But most of the seeds, a very small percent of the seeds, and this is for cheatgrass especially, could live up to 5 years. Ventonata, we think it's not over, they die somewhere between 3 and 4 years. So the seeds don't live very long. And remember that the plant has to produce seeds every year to stay around. right? So one of the keys to controlling these plants and getting a handle on them is stopping them from producing seed every year and doing that for at least a few years in a row, so you can kind of wear out that seed bank. Does that make sense?
So theoretically, you could mow it before it goes to seed and that would be an effective.
You could
control.
mow it or you could graze it. Yeah, targeted grazing is an option, especially for cheatgrass and Japanese brome, not so much for ventonata, which we'll talk about that when we get to this question about the grazing value.
Will it do like knapweed if you keep mowing it down a little, sure, in a shorter height?
Yes, it can. The trick is, you let it get to a height where it's starting to flower. Think about cheatgrass. You're probably most familiar with cheatgrass, right?
Yeah.
If you let it get, a decent height and it's flowering, it looks like when it's flowering, it kind of looks like it's starting to form seed too, right? Grasses don't have big showy flowers, right? The flowering and seed stage looks very similar. But if you come along and mow it at that point, it's much more effective than if you start mowing it when it's this tall and you try to keep mowing it repeatedly. Because eventually it only grows this tall but still produces seed. If you come along and take it off when it's like this, it's poured a bunch of energy into trying to get this tall flower and make seed. Now you're coming and taking that top of the plant, most of the plant off. It may not have enough growing season left to come back and produce as many seeds. You're probably still gonna get some, but you can really reduce seed production by timing it correctly.
But for cattle, it'd be less palatable if it was more mature.
With targeted grazing, you're trying to get in there and graze it multiple times. So you let it get like this, not flowering yet, you come in and take it off to here. It starts growing back, you come in and take it off again. You do it a third time if you could. If we have a real wet summer where we continue to get good moisture. But eventually it dries up, right? And these annuals they've done all they can. Okay, I'm only gonna grow this tall now because it's 1st of July. I don't have much soil moisture and my growing season's really ending. I'm only gonna be this tall and I might produce 10 seeds instead of 200 seeds, right? Yeah.
What about chemical? What chemical?
Yeah, we'll get to that, all right? Let's, when we talk about here, what can we do about invasive annual grasses? So targeted grazing, I'm gonna share some information on herbicides, all right? And that's kind of all we have, unfortunately. Prescribed fire, not really a tool for annual grasses. Unless, you gotta get the timing just right, and it's usually not logistically possible, okay? So let's go on a little bit longer with the seed longevity and then the impacts, all right? Colin asked about impacts. So these annual grasses pretty much do everything that other weedy species do, right? They can form monocultures. They end up reducing forage because they're crowding other things out. And there's not as much of the other plants that we want to have there that are good forage for livestock, wildlife. These annual grasses accumulate a lot of litter, right? You've probably seen that if you've had any substantial cheatgrass infestations. The litter doesn't break down very fast and you get these layers of litter that kind of suffocate other plants from growing. They can change wildfire characteristics. These grasses dry out early in the summer, earlier than our perennials. So you get into the risk of wildfire earlier in the summer. And they kind of form a carpet of litter. So they tend to carry fires farther because you have this continuous layer of fine fuel, flammable fuel. And then soil quality, there's been a little bit of work done with cheatgrass that has shown it kind of changes how nitrogen cycles. through the soil. With Bentonata, we're concerned about erosion because it has a really shallow rooting depth. But if you think about it, you're going from, like, when you get large infestations of these grasses, you're going from an annual dominated system where you don't have as much root material, or sorry, you're going from a perennial dominated system. I mean, some of our perennial grasses have, you know, roots like this, or you think about sagebrush roots, right? I mean, it might be 10 feet deep. You're going from this perennial extensive root system to fairly shallow roots that are turning over on an annual basis. So you end up changing like nutrient cycling in the soil. And what does that mean for soil, all the little organisms living in the soil? You know, we don't really know yet, but there are people studying that, but I'm guessing it has some ramifications for soil health in terms of the microorganisms living there as well.
Okay. I'm also curious on that topic. I've heard this before and I don't know if that was just like some individual's theory or if this is something that has been studied or considered, but I'd heard once that there's like also some fear with Bentonata, like eventually making the soil hydrophobic because of the silica content.
I don't know. I have not heard that. Yeah, it does have high silica content. So it would be like decompose over time as that
Especially
dried up vegetation.
wildfire was how it was posed to me.
Okay. Yeah, I have not been exposed to that idea before.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to talk a little bit about, you know, an impact in terms of grazing value, okay? And I'll tell you about a study we did at MSU where we really wanted to know, is one annual grass worse than another, right? I mean, we've had cheatgrass around for quite a few years, but like now we're all worried about Bentonata. Is there a difference in terms of their impacts? So what we did was we went to 13 different sites across Montana, and each site was dominated by a single species of annual grass. So like we went to 5 different sites where cheatgrass was dominant, 4 where Japanese brome was, 3 Bentonata, and then we just have the one site where where Medusa head is in the state. So we went to these sites and we got down on our hands and knees and we collected like data on how abundant the annual grass was relative to the perennial grasses that were there, assuming that people want perennial grasses for forage production, right? And we came back and, you know, we ran up statistics on our data. And this is kind of this is all that work, like slimmed down to a single slide. But what we saw was that cheatgrass and Bentonata abundance were associated with larger decreases in perennial grass production than the other 2 grasses were. And if you look at this slide here, we're looking at perennial grass abundance going from 0 to like 75% cover relative to annual grass cover going from 0 to 100. So we're looking at cheatgrass in this panel, and hopefully you see there's a negative relationship, right? The more annual grass you get, the less perennial grass you have. With Japanese brome and Medusa head, there was no association. With Bentonata, what do you notice about that negative relationship compared to cheatgrass?
Even more.
It's steeper. Yeah, so what we found was that there was a more negative relationship with Bentonata than with the cheatgrass. We went to 5 cheatgrass sites, 3 Bentonata sites. The other thing we did, so it looks like Bentonata can impact forage production more than cheatgrass. The other thing we did was we collected these grasses, we collected them around first to middle of May, and we looked at their forage quality. So we have our 4 annual grasses here on the top, and then we compared them to blue bunch wheatgrass and western wheatgrass, 2 native perennial grasses that are very common on Montana rangeland, considered good forage. And we looked at crude protein, fiber, and silica. And if you just look at crude protein, all these grasses are pretty similar early in the spring before they start heading out, right? Because animals don't want to eat them once they start, especially the annual grasses, once they start heading out. But decent, I mean, good to excellent forage in terms of crude protein, all right, across all 6 of those grasses. What we're most concerned about is the silica content. And Colin, you've mentioned the silica. If you look at the silica percentage in these samples that we collected and ground up and had them analyzed, if you look at like cheatgrass and the native blue bunch and western, it's like 3 to 4% silica, right? And animals, we know animals will eat cheatgrass and Japanese brome early in the season. But if you look at like ventonata and medusa head, you're looking at like 8 to 9% silica content. And that high silica content leads animals to not want to eat this stuff. Because it's like chewing on glass. Silica is an element that's in glass, it's in sand, right? And anecdote, what people have told me that have ventonata on their property is their animals might either completely avoid it, they don't even try grazing it, or they pick it up and chew on it and then spit it out after they've chewed on it a while, because they can't break it down with their teeth. So when we think about the impacts and, you know, especially for grazing impacts, ventonata is very concerning. I mean, cheatgrass is concerning, but we know you can graze it early in the season. But ventonata is really concerning because it seems to have a bigger impact on forage production. And then the quality of the forage is poor too, because of that high silica content. So that's one of the reasons why, like, we really want people to be looking for ventonata, because we feel like the risk to rangeland, if it gets invaded by ventonata, is, I mean, we won't have any grazing value out there anymore. And we've also seen how fast it can spread in some places. So we're really encouraging people to be looking for it. And if they find it, you know, manage it while they still have small patches. Okay. Okay. We hit a couple things here. Right. We're doing pretty good, I think, time-wise.
Question
Yes.
on, grazing value, have they done any work on, early grazing by pronghorn antelope or elk or any of the grass eaters?
Yeah, not from a research perspective, like where they've been able to control that. And I mean, observationally,
Yeah.
you see them eating, not so much ventonata, but cheatgrass and
Yeah.
Japanese brome.
What about the goats? Do you know how people use goats?
Yeah. I've had this question before as I've talked to people across the state about ventonata, and no one is, I don't recall anybody saying they're trying, the goats are grazing it. Josh, do you remember any information on goats grazing ventonata?
Hasn't there just been one thing where they packed them in so tight for like a day and maybe just trampled it? It was the only way they had success.
Yeah.
I mean, with cattle, just, that's the only thing I've heard of anything, of any success.
Yeah,
That was super intensive.
yeah,
Right?
yeah. And it's more of a physical damage than they're actually eating it. Yeah.
I apologize if you've already answered this and I
No,
missed
that's
it, but, I know you mentioned like when the seed germinates and then, grows with it being a winter crop, but when does it not typically go to seed?
Yeah, great question. So what I've seen, you know, in the places I've worked across Montana, is it's starting to produce viable seed and be very obvious on the landscape. Probably late June, like through the first week of July. Yeah. Now, cheatgrass is much earlier than that, right? Typically. I mean, it depends on the year, right? And just how short spring is before we get into, or maybe how short winter into spring is. But you might see cheatgrass flowering and producing seed by first week of June. So Ventonata is later. Yep. This cheatgrass sample, when you see cheatgrass turn that reddish purple color, it's producing viable seed. Those seeds would be viable, okay? Just as an aside. So if you're thinking about mowing it, or was it you that asked about, you asked about grading, you asked about mowing. You would want to hit it before it turns that reddish purple color. I'll pass that around.
And if it turns reddish purple, say thank God, because none of it ever turns that color. Goes green to straw.
Yeah, yeah. Can we talk a little bit about identification, especially with for Ventonata? Do you all feel comfortable, like you kind of know what cheatgrass looks like? I would like to go through a few tips on Ventonata, because again, we're really trying to find this plant early and I mean, we're kind of in early detection, rapid response mode. Okay, so I'm just gonna go, for the sake of time, I'm just gonna go right to Ventonata ID. And you can follow along with that flyer, the fold out one. And then the other thing that'll be helpful to you is this one pager that's front and back. Some of the same pictures that I'm gonna show on the slides are here on this piece of paper. Okay. So this is a picture. Wow, look at the difference in the color between these two screens. That's amazing.
Which one's more accurate?
Yeah, good. Wow.
That's June and that's July.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. Like, yeah, this is a little too rich of a brown color to me. This is Ventonata in this smooth brome field. But then this one looks a little washed out. Like this would be later in the summer, maybe. Yeah, neither one of them is quite as accurate as what I feel like I've seen. But let's talk about the identification.
Was that a lowland? That strip?
No. This is, I'm gonna share results from a herbicide trial. We're gonna talk about chemical control. This is a field, it's just north of Bozeman on the west side of the Bridgers, kind of up by the Spring Hill area. And it's mostly, it was a field of smooth brome, but it also has some other stuff mixed into it. This is one of the first places we started working on Ventonata, and it's like foothills of the Bridgers, not low lying. But you can kind of see it, this invading front, right? So let's talk about some of the characteristics from seedling all the way to flowering and seed production. So the seedlings have very fine leaves. They're kind of rolled in on themselves, as opposed to cheatgrass, which has broader leaves with hairs, right? These Ventonata seedlings are going to look very delicate and fine to your eye compared to cheatgrass, okay? As the plant starts to develop more and it starts elongating, you want to look for these dark reddish black nodes. And this picture is on the same picture that's on the flyer here. These reddish black nodes, all right? And then if you pull the blade of the grass away from the stem, you're gonna see what's called a ligule. And it's a little piece of plant tissue. It almost looks like a hangnail or a really slender, like fish scale or something pops up right there. Can you see that? Oh, that's right, the laser. See that? This is gonna pop up when you pull the leaf away from the stem, okay? Now, this is a picture of just looking down at the ground, and it's just loaded with these little stems of ventonata. And this is the stage where you're not gonna be able to tell ventonata by looking at seeds or anything at this point. This is where you really wanna hone in on the nodes and that ligule, okay? This is the same area. This is all ventonata in here. These little stick straight stems. What was that?
That you start spraying it around it?
With Roundup? No, I got better stuff for it than. Would you kill the other grasses? That would be the negative thing. Okay, what I'm gonna pass around here, so you can look at, is, here's ventonata. We started collecting it in April, and we collected it, like every 2 weeks, every 2 weeks to 2 weeks until middle of June, early June. And here's cheatgrass that was collected at the same time. So I just want you to compare the ventonata to the cheatgrass, because it'll help you see the difference. You're all familiar with cheatgrass, so look at those, you'll see the purple nodes on there. I don't know if you can really see the visual. Okay. Okay, as it continues to grow, yes,
Go back to that
Josh.
one. You asked about it being in the mountains on trails and stuff.
Right.
Sanders County, Lincoln County, you'll see it a lot in like the skid trails, landings, power lines. And it just like in the mountains, in the forest, and it just like runs right down those.
Yeah, so here, yeah, it's right
That's
along
Sanders
this
County.
road going into a field. So again, thinking about where you're gonna find these.
Mainly
Grasses.
disturbance then, right now,
What was that?
mainly disturbance.
Yes, yeah. And this, I think this screen shows it a little better. See how the ventonata kind of has a yellowish green color to it compared to this broader leaved perennial grass that's growing in here. Hopefully you can kind of pick out that difference in terms of the shade of green. So as the plant continues to develop, it becomes a little easier to see. And when it's actually to the point where it's flowered and it's producing seeds, it totally opens up. So it goes from kind of just these little sticks, almost like pickup sticks coming out of the ground. It continues to mature and it opens up as it's browning out. And this will be, again, late June to early July. That's what I've seen most years. And if you notice the little stems that come off the main stem and hold the florets, come off that main stem almost at a 90-degree angle, which is why it looks so open. It's like your arms coming out of your shoulders. When it starts producing seeds, the seeds have bent awns. So the awns are those little appendages that come off the seed. They stick to things and help seeds move around. With ventonata, they're bent, kind of like the hind legs of a grasshopper. That's what I see. I love this picture because this plant is at that stage of starting to open up. This picture on the right, it's still green, but you can see how the inflorescence is starting to really peel open. And you're starting to get some browning at the tip of the plant where the seeds are starting to ripen. Okay,
How tall is that plant?
probably 8 inches. Ventonata, I've seen it this tall in a dry year. I've seen it maybe this tall, maximum, 12 inches. Okay, that's really all I want to say about identification. Any questions on the identification? All right. Do you have like 10 more minutes of energy? Okay. How are we doing here? we kind of talked about fire, but I want to get to this. What can we do about invasive annual grasses? Is there anything new? So I'm gonna skip to some different slides. We're gonna focus on chemical control. I told you targeted grazing is an option for cheatgrass if you have a bunch of it. It's not really an option for ventonata because of that silica content. So right now, we really are focusing on chemical control. And another reason we're doing that is because for most of Montana, especially where we're finding ventonata, it's just in small patches. And we don't really want to mess around with trying to control it. We want to just control it and do it as well as we can, so it doesn't have a chance to spread. So when it comes to using herbicides on these annual grasses, you're really looking at late summer through fall applications. Because we're trying to target either the seeds in the seed bank, which is one of the tools one of the herbicides I want to show you, or we're targeting the grasses at that seedling stage when they're most susceptible to herbicides. And that's happening in the fall, like late summer to early fall, okay? So here's a table that includes active ingredients and then product names for controlling annual grasses in range and pasture. Now, if you're in a crop system, you have different herbicides available to you, but this is for range and pasture. And I'm really just gonna focus on imazapyr. And then we're gonna drop to the bottom of this table and focus on the active ingredient indazaplam. And I think, Kalina, you have the cheatgrass Mont guide back there too. So Kalina has a publication back there that includes a table that looks very similar to this. All right. So let's talk a little bit about imazapyr. That's sold as Plateau or Panoramic. And it's had kind of a history of not having very variable results with how well it works, especially on cheatgrass. So we did some work here in Montana where we looked at 24 different trials that had taken place for using imazapyr on cheatgrass. And we looked at the data across all those trials and tried to come up with some best practices for using this. And one of the things we found was that the label says to use it at 6 to 12 ounces, but we found that 6 ounces work just as well as 12. So this graph is showing us the different rates that were included across those 24 trials. And then we're looking at control of cheatgrass. So the bigger the bar, the better. Like 100% control would be up here. When we used 6 ounces all the way up to 12, we got similar control at about 60% control of cheatgrass. That's not that great, really, but I'm going to show you data that looks better when we broke this down by timing of application. So timing of application seems to be very important. And what we found, you can apply imazapyr pre-emergent, so before the seedlings come out of the ground, all the way through post-emergent. But what we found was, and again, this is across all those different rates, early post-emergent worked far better than pre-emergent across these 24 different sites in Montana. Well, what does that mean in terms of growth? 1 to 2 leaves in seedling size. So in my experience, this happens about 10 days after we start getting fall moisture. You know, it's hot and dry, like through August. We start getting some moisture in September. Once we get like some good moisture, probably a week to 10 days after that rain you're gonna have 1 to 2 leaf size cheatgrass. If it gets a little bigger, the control falls off a little bit. You might want to go with like the 10 ounce rate to get a little better control, but 6 ounces early post-emergent has worked well for these trials. And then, you know, just visiting with people that have tried this on the ground, it sounds like it's been working for them. Okay, so that's that's old chemistry. That herbicide's been around a long time. It's been used a lot on annual grasses. It's just this work we did in Montana kind of helped to refine how to use it and get the best results, okay? The other herbicide I would like to tell you about, if you haven't heard about it already, is something called Rejuvra, and the active ingredient is Invasive. Have you heard of this chemistry? Because it's been marketed pretty heavy, pretty aggressively. This is actually a pre-emergent, and this is the new thing, okay? To get to your question about what's new. This is actually a pre-emergent herbicide. So the Imazapic, I showed you it worked best post-emergent, right? You already got seedlings up. You're spraying those seedlings. This actually works on seeds in the seed bank. So what it does is, as the root comes out of that seed, it just starts poking its little root out to start growing. That root comes in contact with the herbicide in the top inch or so of soil, and it dies. So you never see emergence of the leaves if you've done this right. All right, if you've got the herbicide on at the right time. One of the beauties of this herbicide for using it in perennial rangeland is that it has limited impact to perennial vegetation. So if you think about the root system of our perennials, they may be at least a foot to a couple feet deep. And the herbicide, this herbicide is staying in the top inch or so of the soil. So those roots that are down below the herbicide are not affected by the herbicide. It's just the little baby roots coming out of those seeds. Okay, does that make sense? So limited impact to perennials. So you can spray it in an area where you have perennials, but you have invasion, these annual grasses growing between the perennials, and it'll take out the annuals without killing the perennials. It just got a label to be used in rangeland in 2020, so it's pretty new, right? We're just going into our third year of really having access to this herbicide. So we're still learning about it. Yeah.
How long does that chemical last in the soil?
Yeah, great question. Because it gives multiple years of control. It's like it's effective in the soil for about 3 years. So what we think, and I'm going to share research results with you. Remember we talked about seed longevity. How long do the seeds live of these annual grasses for the most part? Yeah, 3 years. Yeah. So what we're seeing with this herbicide is if you can get it on with the right timing, especially with Ventonata, you can wear out the seed bank with a single application because it's active in the soil for like 3 years. So every time a seed is in the soil and it's trying to grow, for 3 years, it's coming in contact with this herbicide and dying. Right? Now, I don't know if anybody noticed this part of the slide. It's expensive, right? You apply it at 5 to 7 ounces per acre, and it's about $8 an ounce. So if you're spraying at 5 to 7 ounces per acre, it's about 40 to 50 bucks per acre for the herbicide, which is way higher than most rangeland herbicide. A Imazapic might be 10 bucks an acre. But the beauty of this product is, in addition to this limited impact to perennials, is this multiple years of control. So if you can afford the cost up front and pay for this product, you're gonna get 3, 4, I'll show you some data with Ventonata where we got 5 years of control from a single application. The Imazapic's probably gonna give you 1, maybe 2 years of control if you get it on at the right time. Yeah, Colin.
Do you have to defer grazing for any period of time with application of Rejuvenate?
The label says 2 weeks. There's a 2-week grazing deferment after application. There has been some reports of a little bit of weakening of the roots of perennials. They've been doing some aerial applications in Bighorn County where they have a lot of ventonata. And they have seen, some of the landowners in that area have seen the roots weakening on their perennial grasses the first year after application. So they're actually deferring grazing from those areas that were treated for the first season after application. Yep. And then by the next year, it seems like the perennials have grown out of that root weakening.
The second growing season there.
Yeah. Yeah, so the label says 2 weeks, but some of the anecdotal work in southeastern Montana has said, they're keeping their animals off for that first summer after application.
Label also says don't use on intensively managed hay and some other sites like that.
Yeah,
It's not a magic bullet, right?
it's not a magic bullet. Now, it's being marketed as a magic bullet, but we don't have any magic bullets for any of these invasive species, right? I will say that the work I've done with using indaziflam, it's really impressive. And it's a tool that we have not had in our toolbox before in terms of effective control for annual grasses. So it looks promising, but I would say that, there's still a lot to learn about this herbicide because it's not been around that long, okay?
What about the impact on woody species? Like how close to woody species can you?
You can spray, you could spray over the top.
Okay.
This is actually a herbicide that gets used in plantation settings because it's acting on germinating seeds. So if you think about an already established shrub or tree, it's got its root system. It's not affected by the herbicide. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
makes sense.
It's also used as a bare ground herbicide in those settings where you want to just like gravel yards and whatnot.
My house.
Yeah, so I guess that also gives you a sense of, you got to use this the right way. It's a bare ground herbicide, so.
It's not just ventonata that it's preventing the root of, it's preventing any seed.
Yeah, so,
That's within that first inch.
so if you were to spray an area and then you wanted to seed into it, let's say you were reestablishing an alfalfa stand or you were gonna reestablish a grass stand, you would not want to use this product in that setting because you're gonna have it persisting in the soil for like 3 years. It's best used in areas where you have perennial species out there, but they're being invaded by the annual grasses. So you can come in and control the annual grasses and give those perennials room to grow, right?
So on our hillsides, we'll have steep hillsides and they'll have cheatgrass on them. So when ventonata comes in or it's cheatgrass and put the rejuver on it. And then we have one of our extreme storms come through. What do we have? We have to be concerned about the waterways down below.
If you still have perennial vegetation on these hillsides, so you have perennials, but then the cheatgrass or ventonata is kind of in between the perennial, filling in the space. If you control this will control the annuals and the perennials will be hopefully released and hold the soil in place, right?
So the water that's going down the hill, because it's pretty gravelly,
Mm-hmm.
that rejuver that's in that groundwater then is not gonna be an issue.
If you have soil moving, it's gonna move with the soil.
What about the water? It'll soak and then it'll come on through and percolate through and down it.
The water not so much. This herbicide binds very tightly to the soil. But if you have soil movement, it's gonna move with the soil. Yeah. Okay, I promised you I'm gonna share this herbicide trial information with you. So this is that same area where when we were talking about ID and you could see the Ventonata moving in. We did a herbicide trial up there 6 years ago now. And we were working on Ventonata. And what we did was we had, 10 treatments total. We tried Indaziflam. It was marketed as Esplanade at that point because it didn't have the grazing label yet. This was experimental. So we applied Indaziflam. We applied 4 other herbicides that are commonly used for annual grasses, which you can see there, including Imazepig, glyphosate. And then we had plots where we applied Indaziflam plus the other herbicides. So the other herbicides would give 1 year of control, and then the Indaziflam would stick around for 2 or 3 years to hopefully give longer term control. So we applied this in November of 2016, and we've been following this study ever since. So this year will be 7 years of data. We're still doing it. And I'm gonna show you, data for the first 3 years, and then I'm gonna skip to year 5. So this is kind of a confusing graph, but this was July of 2017, July 2018, and July 2010, and we're looking at percent control. So the bigger the bar, the better the control of Ventonata. And then there's a group of 10 bars here that represent our 10 treatments. Okay, so I'm gonna zoom in. The first year, we saw variable results across those herbicides. The second year, anything that included Indaziflam is starting to do better with higher control. And then I just zoom in on year 3. So this is 2019. You'll see that in any treatments that included Indaziflam, that gold bar on the left, or that set of 4, which were the combination herbicides, Indaziflam plus, we're giving like 95 to 100% control 3 years after application. Year 4 and 5, this was 20 and 21. It's still controlling Ventonata. So now I'm gonna show you a slightly different slide. This is 5 years after treatment, and now we're looking at the canopy cover of Ventonata, not control of Ventonata, but canopy cover. So now these are means right here. The lower those bars are, the better the control. And you see anything that included Indaziflam, that's the I. There's just that's Imazepig. Anything that included Indaziflam, we weren't finding any Ventonata in those plots 5 years after treatment. So I was like, well, or did we actually wear out the seed bank? Are there any seeds left in the soil? So that same summer, we went out and we collected like the top inch or so of the soil and the duff on the top of the soil. We collected that across all those plots, brought it into the greenhouse and laid it out in these trays and watered it, and, gave it good growing conditions to see what came up. Is anything coming up out of those little soil samples? So I'm going to show you a graph that shows you what came up, looking at emerged seedlings. So this is the number of seedlings per sample in one of those trays that I just showed you. This would be the plots that were never sprayed with anything. Okay, we had about 90 seedlings per tray, and equally split almost between broadleaves and grasses. Here's a Imazepig, one-time application. 5 years later, it's not any different than the control. We got about 100 seedlings per sample across those. These real low bars that you see were all the treatments that included Indaziflam. Okay, so here's a visual of, if these types of figures don't resonate with you, here's a visual. This was a sample taken from a control, never sprayed. Here's a sample taken from a plot that was treated with Indaziflam. So it looks like that single application wore out the seed bank. There's nothing coming out of the seed bank. Now, that includes Ventonata. It also includes any other species that were in there, right? Like you can see there's other stuff coming up in here, this, you know, there's broadleaves. So as Josh said, this herbicide is acting on any seed in the seed bank, not just the annual grasses. Annual grasses seem to be especially sensitive to it, but other things are susceptible to it as well. So if it does get used, you know, it needs to be used in a place where you know, you're not concerned about other things that might be in the seed bank. And you can't use it in places where you want to revegetate. That makes sense? So that's what I got. That's kind of the new.
Was that a smooth brown field that it was in?
It's predominantly smooth brome, but there's also thick spike wheatgrass, western wheatgrass. There's mountain brome in there. There's some blue bunch wheatgrass. There's some native and non-native forbs in that field too.
Does that scare you
Perennials.
guys that it's invading smooth brown?
Yeah,
I've seen
Yeah.
great results with that, with Rejuva, but I've also, you just have to be aware. I've seen not great results. But I would say it's like the best thing about Rejuva, it has a 5-year residual. The worst thing about Rejuva, it's got a 5-year residual.
yeah.
So you better just know what your site is and what's there.
This is some of the work we're doing over in Bighorn County on the Crow Reservation where there's all that ventonata. So here's a plot, I tried to outline it, that we treated with imazapic. And that's all ventonata out there, that light yellow green. And this is all western wheatgrass that came back in when we controlled the ventonata. Here's a plot that was treated with indaziflam. And they gave saw equally good control with either herbicide. So, you know, if you're dealing with ventonata, which hopefully you're not, but, you know, imazapic works really well on it too.
So it's costing you about 1/10, but you're gonna be spraying it until you've exhausted the
Yeah.
seed bank.
Yeah,
Like 5 years,
yeah.
time, equipment, pluses and minuses to everything.
But what I think's amazing is, you know, this is like 50% cover of ventonata. You would go out there and you might just shake your head like, oh, this is totally lost cause. But look at all the western wheatgrass that is still in there. If you just control the annual grass. It's quite impressive to have that sort of resilience. And you know, I think our grasslands are very resilient here. So if we are seeing these annual grasses invade, we get good response if we can selectively control them. Yeah,
How often do the perennial grasses have to reseed themselves in order to maintain the stand?
not that often. Yeah, there's been a little bit of work done on that over the years. Like blue bunch wheatgrass, it may only produce viable seed every 12 to 15 years. Those perennial grasses are relying more on growth from their root system and tillering. Like you think about a blue bunch wheatgrass plant, maybe it's this big around, right? Over time, it gets bigger and bigger, just more and more tillers coming out of the ground. It's only occasionally that our perennial grasses actually produce viable seed. So that bodes well for like this issue of, you know, well, we're actually killing the seed bank. Okay, I think I've talked enough. We've hit most of these questions. Anything we're missing?
So, as my first introduction to this, it's amazing to me and very informative. And thank you for that. But one question I have.
Yeah.
Is, it sounds like this, all of the invasive weeds, or especially this ventonata, it can be, it is, it's very destructive to an agricultural and a ranch-based economy.
Mhm.
And so I guess the question I have, if it's that bad, and it sounds that bad to me, and it can impact the livelihood of everybody. So can the state help? Do they have funds available to help individuals with application, with guidance, with the cost? Because it's expensive.
Yeah, so, yes, and there's also, like, the NRCS also has programs that help. So, like, our Department of Agriculture, Josh works for the Department of Agriculture, the State Department of Agriculture. They have, grant programs that support, they support weed management on private land when, neighbors come together to do that. Because weeds don't care whose land they're growing on, right? So these grants want to support cooperative weed management areas where adjacent landowners are working together to tackle a noxious weed management issue, okay? So they do offer like a cost share program. Counties also, I don't know what it is in Madison and Jefferson, but, like counties have some cost share funds they can do where like they'll pay for half the cost of herbicide or half the cost of a commercial application. It kind of varies from county to county. And then, NRCS also has programs where, neighbors' cooperative efforts, they'll support cooperative efforts. So you can manage invasive plants on bigger landscapes than just an individual person's parcel of land. Am I missing anything that's important there?
We
Yeah.
have a huge grant with FWP
Okay.
we use.
Who's
Is
running
that-
that one?
Is that a whip, one of the whip?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Smith Wells is the,
I mean, who's like applied for it?
I have a grant right now. We're
Oh,
writing
nice.
an effort beyond for.
Cause not very many people are doing it.
Yeah, we were the maiden voyage. on that grant.
Yeah, so Fish, Wildlife and Parks has a program, it's called the Wildlife Habitat Improvement Program, WHIP. And again, it supports these, multi-cooperator groups that they'll help to support, noxious weed management. But, you're in Madison County, right? Yeah, so talking like the Madison Valley, I'm missing.
You're on the Ruby Valley.
Or
So
yeah, what
you're
side
on,
are you
you're
on?
on the Ruby Valley side.
Dale Gross over in Alder, I guess we are in Alder, is the county lead
County,
guy.
yeah, county weed coordinator.
Yep, and then if you have any questions, the NRCS office and Conservation District office is in Sheridan. And I work for the Conservation District. Yeah.
You didn't mention anything about biological control.
Yeah, we don't have anything for these native grasses. We've tried different things. There have been some soil amendments that are like bacteria based or fungal based. And, the research that's been done has shown they don't work.
Micronutrients.
We're doing some work, actually, yeah, so this site here that, is Ventonata, we're also including a soil nutrient amendment, as an option. It worked at 2 of our 4 sites. It decreased Ventonata cover by about half. So it went from like 50% cover to 25% cover. But, I think actually this is good, because this is one of the plots that had the nutrient amendment next to, herbicide control, no treatment at all, herbicide. So there's some reduction, but it's not to the extent that you're gonna get with a herbicide.
What did that cost per acre for that one?
I don't know, but it's
Was it
pricey.
Edifax?
Yeah. Yeah, but the biocontrol, yeah, they continue to do research for looking at, for mites and fungal pathogens for these annual grasses, but so far nothing has panned out.
Like with knapweed, it's kind of frustrating when you see where they've released the bugs and you go over there and you pull the plant and the whole inside of the plant is nothing but, bare,
Yeah,
core.
it's been eaten.
You've been
out.
eaten from the
Yeah.
inside, but then the plant's still gonna go to seed this year and how many more years before the bug finally does the job? It's like, well,
Especially if it's at your brother's cabin and he's letting you use it. and he's letting you look at the knapweed.
Yeah. So, we,
kind of frustrating it's such a long acting thing, but then you don't get 100%. They claim that the bug population's gonna drop, well then, along with the weed population dropping, well then, pretty soon the bugs are gone, and then the plants come back, and so, what good did you do?
yeah, well, with biocontrol, we don't have anything for annual grasses, right? But let's say we got something, or let's say you're looking at biocontrol on knapweed. Those insects are they're helping to keep a population suppressed, but they're not gonna completely eliminate it.
Mhm.
So when you think about biological control, it's really most applicable to use that when you have big infestations in hard to reach areas or, where you're just not gonna be able to get to it with other tools. So the biocontrol is an option to at least stress the plants and reduce their competitive ability. But in most situations, an invasive plant does not go away completely just because it has something feeding on it, right? So but in a lot of cases, it's like all we have. You think about some of these landscapes that are hundreds of acres of the weeds and they're on steep slopes and hard to reach and, they don't have there's not a big economic return on those lands if you were to be able to treat them with a herbicide. So it's an option in some places, but not, the weeds don't completely go away. All right, I think that.
Almost everything I've learned about weeds, I've learned from her and her research. And one thing she's always hit on is hitting things from multiple ways is always gonna be more successful
Yeah.
than one, so. We have seen biocontrol success and, in some ways, but it's not the answer. Just like Rejuva is not the answer. People are making a lot of money on Rejuva, so they might tell you that, but. Yeah, it's so new. It's been spread since 2015, so there's a lot, it's not known.
Yeah, on small scale stuff in 2015. Here's my contact information, so, if you have other questions about other weeds too, anything on a noxious weed list, Colleen always knows how to get a hold of me too, so she's a good first point of contact. And if she can't answer all your questions, we'll put our heads together and help try to answer your questions, okay?
Thanks, Jane.
Yeah, thank you.
We can plan for next year.
How many inches of percent?
And thanks for coming tonight.